I'm Savannah Turley, and I'm a sourdough baker, and I'm here to answer all the questions that you've sent to Local Roots and to me. So I'm going to go ahead and read aloud the questions and then give it an answer. So the first question, how should I store sourdough? I usually leave half on the counter and half in the freezer to use later. So I don't recommend keeping it in the freezer. You can keep it in the fridge. If you're already keeping it out, there's not really any point in having one in the fridge and one out, because you can at any moment use the starter that's on the counter, and the one that's in the fridge you're going to have to wake up. So if you are going to bake almost every day and keep one active on the countertop, I would just keep that one. If you want to retard it for a few days or up to a month, you can do that by just putting it in the fridge at the peak. So when it passes the float test or when you see a lot of activity on it, and you can put it in the fridge and take it out 3 to 4 days before you want to bake to reactivate it. At that point, I'd recommend only throwing away half of it so that you get more active yeast spores. The other option is to dehydrate it for long-term storage, and that process is using an offset spatula to create a really thin layer on a piece of parchment, and then leaving it of your starter, and then leaving it at room temperature or in an off oven for about 24 hours, and it will become these flakes that you can easily mail around or keep on a shelf for years. I've got a starter from a friend, but I'm clueless. What should the feeding schedule be, and do I have to use bread flour when I'm finally ready to bake, or can I use AP? Okay, so congratulations, welcome to baking. So your feeding schedule is daily. You feed it, I tend to recommend feeding it in the morning because you're going to be working on a daily feeding, and generally speaking, if you do it in the morning, you won't forget. The best way to feed it is kind of eyeball throwing away 80% of it and feeding using grams, equal parts flour and water. That'll make what's called a 100% hydration starter, which a lot of recipes will call for. So when you're making that, or when you're integrating your daily feedings or beginning to integrate your daily feedings into your day-to-day schedule, if you're planning on making bread, you need to mix the correct amount of starters. So if you're gonna need 200 grams of starter for your recipe, you know you have to mix with 100 grams of water and 100 grams flour the night before. But if you're just keeping it alive, you don't need to go through that much starter. You can just keep it alive with, say, 30 grams flour, 30 grams water. Because there is such a flour shortage right now, I know a lot of people are trying to minimize the amount of discard that they have. There's also really great discard recipes. Easy one is pour discard directly into a hot pan, and you'll get, you can spread herbs, scallions, whatever you want, flip it, and you have a really yummy kind of pancake-esque thing. Oh, and you can use AP. It's going to be harder for you to build tension, which is what bread flour does, because it has a higher protein level. You're going to easily develop more tension and more elasticity and strength. All those little holes inside of the bread that sourdough generally has is formed because of strength in the dough. And the dough allows you to build strength the higher protein you have in it. So if you're using all-purpose, you'll still get bread. You just might get a slightly denser, less chewy, less crusty loaf. But you can absolutely do it if that's all you can find. I've got bubbles and passed the float test, but I've got no rise. Help me rise, please. Okay, so if you have bubbles and you pass the float test, then you are probably ready to bake. Getting the rise is usually associated with temperature. So depending on where you are, if you can find a warmer place in your kitchen or wherever you're mixing, to keep your starter, that will generally attribute to the rise. The other is if you can get some live flour, something that's not milled, like steamrolled milled, or bleached. So whole grain, rye, something like that will kind of jolt your starter into having more activity. Where to start if you're new to sourdough baking and feel a bit intimidated? I totally understand. Everyone started somewhere, so it is totally attainable to make a loaf even if you've just started. So I don't know if you have a sourdough starter culture yet. If you don't, you can get it from a bunch of different places. I'm mailing out dehydrated starter. There are a ton of people who are kind of sending their yeast far and wide. And so I'd recommend getting a sourdough starter to begin. The big thing that when I was starting is I would just read recipes over and over again, keep it by my bedside, and just start to learn that way. And honestly, the biggest thing is just doing it. I know that it's intimidating to start because it seems like there's so many different parts to it. But having an understanding of what dough feels like at different stages is the only way you're going to get better. Again, I'm teaching a class if you'd like to join in. Also, I have instructions on my website. You can download a zine. And there's a lot of information on Sarah Owen's website, and then also on Bon Appetit has a really good bread sort of for beginners, sourdough for beginners guide that is useful to kind of understand the basics and the steps involved. There's a lot of information on different people's Instagrams, but you kind of have to understand the basic like vocabulary. So I'd recommend kind of learning some of the vocabulary via cookbooks, websites, etc., so that when someone talks about an autolyse or proofing or bulk ferment or those kinds of things, you know what they're talking about. You can translate that into your own baking. I'm using the King Arthur sourdough starter recipe, but using all-purpose flour. Haven't been able to get anything else. The first few days seemed great, bubbling, sourdough smell, seemed to be growing, etc. It's been 9 days, and after probably 6 or 7, the activity leveled off. I'm still getting a few bubbles, but not as much activity and virtually no growth at all. Do you have any advice? Thank you again. Okay, so I think probably you're kind of plateauing because of the all-purpose. So if you can find, it doesn't have to be bread flour, but if you can find some kind of whole grain flour, I think that is going to, like I said, really energize your starter. Having the endosperm and the wheat germ in the flour that you use that's freshly milled is really essential to getting a healthy feeling starter. You can order it online. So there's tons of sources and local mills or small mills that are shipping all over the country. I'm getting mine from Central Milling Company in Petaluma. Janie's Mill is a great source. There's Cape Mills. There's, I know, Farmer's Ground or the Grow NYC. There's a website called Grinder Finder that has a place that you can find this kind of stuff. So I recommend getting some kind of whole grain into that starter. And also probably what's happening is you're getting a more consistent, it's getting used to what you're feeding it. So if rather than, as you develop more, you're going to get less dramatic rises and falls than what you saw in the first couple days, but you're still going to get them. So temperature, it also could be a slightly more active starter now, so you could be missing the rise as like it's happening in the middle of the night or something. So see if you can keep an eye on it throughout the process to see if you're sort of missing some of the rise and fall. Or another good way is to put a rubber band around or mark on your jar where it started, so that you can see where it potentially got to and then fell. Okay, I'm in the first few days of growing my starter. Should I feed it when there's a hooch apparent on top, even if it's not been 24 hours since the last feeding? So yes, so I wouldn't feed it, but I would make sure to pour that off. That is once you get rid of the sort of hooch, as you say, or the alcohol on top or vinegar, I wouldn't necessarily feed right again. If you're starting to see bubbles, then that's a good indication that your starter is becoming more active, but I wouldn't feed it too often, because then you're kind of cleaning out the spores that you've been trying to cultivate. So once you start seeing the bubbles, that's a plan. That's when you want to feed again. In the early stages of building a sourdough starter, you do want to keep more than what you would in a normal feeding behind. If you can find someone to give you starter, I really do recommend having a slightly older starter. It just will give your bread a better result, but also you can grow your own as you are. And I would say if you're seeing vinegar on top, pour the vinegar off, wait for the full 24 hours, then do your feeding. The vinegar on top is really just the microbiome of your starter beginning to die off. So kind of get rid of those and try and foster a good environment for the new spores that are growing. Again, a warm environment and some whole grains usually really help usher along some rise and fall. Okay, I hope this was very informative, and please feel free to reach out with any other questions. I'm very much available these days. You can reach out on Instagram or on my website, whatever feels good to you. Thanks so much.